How's it going? It's very polite. So for those of you who I'm just meeting for the very first time, my name is Dessa. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Mary Jo, for the invitation to be part of this evening. I make my living as a touring performer. That's me in the boots. I'm a member of a crew called Doomtree. That's me in the updo. And as you might imagine, in this line of work, there are very often expectations about a way that a professional is expected to look. Ideally, a performer is supposed to have a glowing, clear skin, white, even teeth, a youthful, energetic buoyancy, and she is supposed to maintain that by staying up until about 3 a.m. every evening, eating on her lap in a moving vehicle, drinking most nights, and reliving trauma in music 5 nights a week. So I've been aware for a long time now that in some ways there's a little bit of conflict between what I'm passionate about. So, for example, a lot of artists in any field who are really, really dedicated to their craft. You notice here that a quick Google search of what a rock star looks like is there's a lot of daylight between what a sleep-deprived woman looks like. But very often, the former is the latter for everything but that 90 minutes that she's performing on stage. And in a lot of other disciplines as well, artists are making like big concessions, big compromises to their health. A lot of art isn't actually very good for your body to do, right? Ballerinas who dance on point really do break the hell out of their feet. I toured earlier this year with a particular physical therapist based in Cape Town, South Africa, who'd written his dissertation on the way that violinists, really skilled orchestral violinists, like play their arms out of their sockets in the course of their work. Singers, if you happen to be a fan of like a big arena act, like Adele, you'll notice that every once in a while tours get canceled, sometimes because of exhaustion and sometimes because the actual mechanism of the vocal cord, of the larynx, just can't withstand that kind of traffic. And even in very, very disciplined arenas, like in the classical art song environment, you have singers who will wear chalkboards around their neck that say vocal rest day because they've decided that they want to sing beautifully on Saturday, which means that they've given up the opportunity to speak on Thursday or Friday. That's a big deal, man. That's a big concession to make. So I think, particularly as I grow older, I'm 37 years old. This is hey. This is a young man's game. I'm aware of that conflict between my big passion and my personhood, that sometimes it feels like there are really competing interests. When I was a teenager and first becoming moody, artsy, interested in literature in earnest, fascinated by words and eager to try to assemble some in a compelling order myself, I was reading a lot of Plath in the basement, and I remember writing a journal entry and a lot of juvenilia poetry saying, I think I'm less interested in happiness than other people. Not that I want to be unhappy, no interest in suffering for its own sake, but maybe I want something else more. Maybe I'm willing to forfeit some happiness chips for meaning and for passion. And at 15, the question that hadn't yet been posed explicitly, of course, was how many of them are you going to forfeit and how long is that sustainable, man? That was me. I am the young man with the apple core on her right knee. Sorting out those kind of questions. Most of us, however, I think first experience a conflict between our immediate desires, the stuff we really care about, and our long-term well-being when we're really little in our first experiences with the healthcare system. Shots, right? It's supposed to be good later, but it sucks now. And in the first shot that I remember anyway, I remember my mom was like bracing me for it because I was old enough that we were going to talk about it before we got to the doctor's office. And I was tripping. I was not excited about the endeavor. I wasn't sure that I agreed with the cost-benefit analysis that she'd laid out for me. And I was sitting by myself in the mudroom next to our radiator. My mother had explained, baby, the needle is so small that it can go into your arm and it won't hurt too much. It's not like a fork. They make it so little. They make it so little that it won't hurt. And I remember contemplating that, waiting for the time that we were supposed to head out to the doctor's office. I remember that moment not only as my first memory of an intersection with the healthcare system, but also as my first foray into philosophy, because I was sitting next to the radiator and I thought, oh, I wish it was smaller than however it is. I wish it was like half as big as it is. I wish it was so small it could go into the radiator. And then I remember thinking, what if it was half as small? I bet it would hurt like half as much. And then, what if it was even half as small as that? Oh, maybe even half as small. And then I went and told my mom that in the mudroom I had discovered infinity. There's a concept I need to tell you about before we go to the pediatrician. I ended up earning a degree in philosophy from here, University of Minnesota. And unlike my other courses, in philosophy classes, you don't generally learn a lot of like take it to the bank absolute facts. Instead, you learn how to ask questions and how to frame them differently. So a question like, what is a good life? How is a human life best spent? How much of my energy and my attention am I allowed or encouraged to spend on myself? How much of it must be spent elsewhere on others? People I love? People I hate? People I don't know? People who aren't born yet? How does this network of moral affiliation actually work? Who do I owe and who owes me and how do I get it? So one of the things that I found most fascinating about my philosophical studies was this idea of the good life. And most philosophers will say, well, to even start on that question, we got to start on, from your perspective, on one before it, which is, what is the ultimate good? And I always thought that was such an interesting phrase. In short, a lot of philosophers ask, is there a variable in our human lives that we ought to try to optimize when we can? So some philosophers have said, yes, there is a variable, and that variable is happiness. We have to make sure that we're doing the greatest good for the greatest number. So what I'm not saying is I just want to get mine and I want to be happy, but I have to be mindful of how my behaviors affect not only my happiness, but yours and yours and yours, and out as best as I'm able to the entirety of the human and sometimes animal community. And they get real sciencey about it. You know, they push up their glasses and their sleeves and they measure, they proposed a unit of measurement for happiness called a utile. That philosophy very often is called utilitarianism by Bentham and Mill. And other philosophers will say, no, philosophy alone, happiness alone isn't the ultimate good. There also has to be the presence of virtue. And other philosophers will say, okay, I think it's more about an adherence to a code of noble conduct, and I think it's about the fulfillment of duty. And then other philosophers will say, there's nothing. I think you guys are just soft pinballs. Good luck in the universe. There is no moral order. You said like recently you just beat a nihilist in poker. I think they're tough as hell to argue against. I think they've got it's tricky. They're tricky. Big Lebowski and beyond. So, and then some existentialists will say, well, okay, there's nothing naturally here, but maybe we can build meaning. Maybe we can build purpose. Maybe we can make it for ourselves. Note to self, don't jump in a laugh. The question as I was studying philosophy was that, what is the ultimate good? What is the ultimate good? Interesting. And then as I began to try to engage with that in my own life and read some really compelling arguments, oftentimes of positions that were counterintuitive, but so well argued that I had to reconsider my position. Maybe my intuitions were leading me wrong. After all, we are all of us, subject to influence by our culture. And our culture probably isn't right on absolutely every point, because historically none of them have been. So as I was reconsidering some of my fundamentally held positions, I wondered, towards Mary Jo's point, is there a way to incorporate purpose somehow into an ultimate good? Can that somehow be ferried in? And then, even pulling the lens back a little bit more, I thought, is there also something we want more than the standard than the items or the variables that are often identified as the ultimate good? Like, I want to be happy, I want to be purposeful, I want to be healthy. But if we think of like a matrix environment, many of us are really reluctant, even for the promise of riches and legit happiness, to part with an honest understanding of our lives. So that goes from everybody from Copernicus. Like, what a disappointing discovery. We're not at the center. We're not nearly as important as we thought we were. Drag. But nonetheless, I want to know it because it's true and it's real, and I have a vested interest in better understanding the universe in which I live and my place within it. It goes all the way from that cosmic level to like the Tuesday afternoon level that nobody wants to be an unwitting side piece, right? If I said, hey, you're right now in a happy partnership that's stable, steady, financially comfortable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can choose to find out that in fact your partner doesn't reciprocate your feelings in the way that you think that he or she or they do. Would you care to know? Most of us would say, gosh, I think I might forfeit this happily ever after thing to understand the true scenario in which I'm living my life. Did you go, Yeah? That's the money vocal in philosophy. So I'm taking it, I'm pretending you did. At the same time, of course, this is, in my early 20s, one of the most important, sidebar. This is at one of my favorite bookstores. I love this bookstore in New York. This is one of my least favorite sectional signs. Is there a less inclusive sign for a young, aspiring female philosopher than this sign? Are you kidding me right now? But then a quick Google search for philosophy was not intellectually rigorous in the same way that I had hoped it would be, so we're stuck with him. Anyway, at this point in my life, when people are finishing up their undergraduate degrees, there is also one question that tends to thrust itself into your purview, irrespective of your interest in it, which is, how am I gonna pay rent? And for me, I got a gig as a subcontractor, working with Medtronic. I was a medical technical writer. Most of my work there focused on cardiac technology. So my job was to learn enough about how the heart worked, how pacemakers and defibrillators worked, to be able to write legible instructions about how those devices could be implanted into human patients. This thrilled and terrified me. There was a lot of high fives when projects were done, and more than once there were some tears at the stress of it. Also, I was so excited to have a job that did feel in some way purposeful, irrespective of whether it was going to be in my long-term career plan. I felt so excited, and like most of us, when you're young and starting out, I felt so terrified about being discovered. As a little younger maybe than people thought I was. So I took my mother's pager and I took the batteries out and I wore it on my hip. And she had split from my dad by then, but I knew where her wedding ring was, so I wore that too. And then if ever there was a question whose answer I was unsure, I would go, absolutely, oh, sorry. Absolutely, Frank, I'm coming right back, 2 seconds. It's great. And while I was working at Medtronic, I got, circumstantially, a science education, I got to learn about cardiac technology. I got to reconsider also some of my ideas about health when I was confronted with new empirical data with which I had been previously unfamiliar. I think a lot of times it's really tempting as we thumb through magazines or listen to the radio to imagine that some things are healthy and some things are unhealthy. There's a binary relationship, and that's how that goes. We're also tempted to think that there's physical health and there's mental health. And we're getting better, I think, on both fronts. I do. I think that we're getting better. But working at Medtronic, it was fascinating to learn how thresholding works. Really, we're looking for a threshold of function in the heart here. And we've got to be mindful as we dial up or dial down a pacing impulse, what other kind of symptoms we might be inadvertently promoting in a patient. And oh, look, okay, not every patient is going to respond in the same way. Interesting that some populations have been studied more than others, right? So we know more about how their bodies work. I also learned a business term while I was at Medtronic, working with Medtronic, that has stuck with me ever since. It was the first time I'd ever heard someone in a presentation use the word double bottom line. And you all know how cute. You don't know what a double bottom line. Shut up. Some people here don't know what a double bottom line is either. When an organization decides that in addition to trying to maximize profits, they're going to be mindful of another variable. Usually it's a social good. And I thought, okay, so I wonder if you could do that with the ultimate good. Like maybe I could have more than one variable that's contributing to the spot at which I'm trying to balance my life on the fulcrum of competing interests. Maybe, in fact, there would be more than two. Maybe it would be like a spirograph of the variables that are important to me, and I would try to perch myself on the highest point at which they all align. Sorry, Frank, I'm thinking about something else. At about this time in my life, I was 23, I think, I head to the doctor for an appointment on something else and was diagnosed with an ovarian tumor. The doctor said it was serious enough to really want to schedule an oophorectomy, the removal of my ovary, within the next 2 weeks max. Said the tumor was mobile, and I didn't really know what that meant, and I imagined it like in a biplane in a little leather helmet kind of motoring around my right ovary. Surgery came out. I was a bleeder, but otherwise pretty good. The recovery was a little slower than they would anticipate for someone in my age demographic. Still young, still pretty healthy. But it started to become clear that after the stitches had healed up, something was pretty wrong. I had like an insomnia that wasn't like the way that I have, when I complain about insomnia now, it's a very different phenomenon. I just had never stayed up the whole night before. And I remember just deciding, I guess I'll stand up now. And I looked and I could see the woman that I had been lying in bed, kind of like a crime scene victim in sweat, because I hadn't moved for so many hours. And then my thinking started to really blur. Something was wrong with my brain. And then I crashed a car. And then I called someone to come and find me, but when they found, I think it was my dad, but I was in it wasn't a bad accident, it was like a fender bender, everyone was okay. But I was in the wheel well of the passenger side doing the rocking thing and saying the phrase again and again, I'm so small, I'm so small, I'm so small. So fast forward, not too long, week, 2 weeks, time got a little squishy. I ended up at the psych ward at Regents Hospital, 4th floor, under the care of a man named Dr. Rush, who I haven't spoken to ever since. Thank you, man. I hope this gets back to you in some way. Pulled my chart. It wasn't his side of the alphabet. He usually did like A through N, but took mine, took my life story, called my teachers to see if I was lying. And I was diagnosed with cyclothymia, which is like a low-carb bipolar. So you're having these mood swings, but you don't go as high, but you do go as low. And it can be dangerous because mixed states are when people usually attempt suicide, meaning you've got all the unhappiness of a depressive episode, but you're energized with mania. So I was put on lithium, and for the first time in my life, I had no words. And I remember looking at my mom in the car, trying to explain that I had been cored. But I didn't have any metaphors. So I just looked out the window. Finally, Dr. Rush pulled me off lithium, put me on an anti-seizure drug that didn't work too well either, and said, hey, Dad, he didn't say, hey, Des. He said, we haven't studied the way that female hormones affect the body all that much. But there's a phenomenon of otherwise pretty like well-socialized women and girls who would become arsonists, burn down the damn houses. And he showed me my chart, and he'd indicated how many times when I had been in these states where my mom would sometimes say, we should go see a shrink, but then like 4 days later I was good, so then what am I gonna do in this guy's office? Like, what am I gonna say? I felt weird on Tuesday. When you ran away from home, you're on your period. When you broke up with Diego, you're on your period. He had charted the major moments in my life and indicated that there might be some relationships. So he said, what if we take you off all these drugs and we put you on a hormone and see if your body regulates itself? So they gave me a room where I got off the, for those of you who have ever been manic, you know the feeling. They gave me a dance room. So it was technically after curfew. You know, you're not allowed to have like shoelaces or cords because you're a suicide risk, but they gave me a room to dance. And the nurses would come in and go, you need water? You good? As I'm coming off these meds and just losing my mind. And they'd say, I heard you did your hair like 50 times today. I did. Okay, good. I was very, very well cared for. But at those times in my life, the question was like, how much am I willing to give up to make art? The question was, are you safe to leave the hospital? Do you have someone who will notice if you start behaving like this again? Can you tell me when you're healthy how fast you usually talk so that I can get a baseline? Then afterwards, knowing that that had been my diagnosis, someone gave me a magazine called The Icarus Project, which was about bipolar kids. And I flipped through it feeling all shook up because there were these poems and there were these pictures and there was these songs. And one of the writers had said, one of the features that sometimes people with bipolar report experiencing is feeling like when they're in the throes of that overwhelming sensation, that connections are made plain to them. And I thought, that's me. It's only when I write metaphors that I'm really pleased with, that I'm in those throes of those weird moods. And then my question wasn't how many chips am I gonna forfeit? Then my question was, is the part of me that's broken my favorite part? Can I write songs on this pill? I've got -1 minute, so I'll be quick, but I came across my favorite framing question just a year or two ago when I was talking to a psychologist here in the Twin Cities. He treated schizophrenics. Matt treated mostly schizophrenics who just had their first psychotic episode, which he described as a very treatable group, but where the standard questionnaires ask questions like, how often are you hearing voices? And how loud are they? He emphasized the question, are you living the way that you want to live? Having good relationships, going to school, to work? He says, when I'm dosing medication, I don't go up until the voices have gone away. I go up until my patients can live the way they want to. And I was fascinated by the idea that auditory hallucinations had volume knobs. I asked him, do you think that happiness and sadness work like light and dark, where sadness is, where happiness isn't? Or is it like red and blue, where they're both distinct entities? And he said, if I could answer that eloquently, I'd probably be in another line of work. And I said, that's fair. But he said, I don't treat sadness. Sadness is something we all feel. We have a right to feel, and we are obligated to feel. Depression, on the other hand, is a pathological state. Unprompted by me, he brought up the human appetite for sadness in art. How many people have rented Steel Magnolias, and they somehow enjoy it? I know, I said, most of my songs are really sad. And he said, they are. And I was flattered that he listened. Before we got off the phone, Matt had something he wanted to add to contextualize our whole conversation. He says, we've all been trying to pick up the pieces from Descartes. The whole mind-body dichotomy is false. We're a big meat bag powered by a meat computer. And if anybody tells you it's all in your head, where else would it be?